I still remember the exact date when my life split into two completely different versions of me. February 18th, 2021. That was the day I found out my husband of almost 9 years had been cheating on me. I can still feel the weight of that moment like it happened yesterday, the hollow sound in my chest, the numbness in my hands, and the way the world around me suddenly went quiet, like someone had turned off the volume. My name's Emily Carter. I was born and raised in Raleigh, North Carolina, and when I met Jason back in 2010, I honestly thought I had found my forever person. We met at a friend's barbecue, one of those sticky summer nights when the air smells like grilled burgers and bug spray, and the humidity clings to your skin. I was 23, working as a dental assistant, and still figuring myself out. Jason was charming, funny, and the kind of guy who could make an entire room light up. He had this way of making me feel like I was the only person who mattered in the world. We got married in 2012. Back then, life felt simple. We bought a small three-bedroom house on the outskirts of Raleigh, painted the walls ourselves, and spent our weekends at Jordan Lake or catching cheap Tuesday night movies. In 2014, we had our first son, Ethan, and 2 years later, our second, Caleb. I thought we were building a life together, the kind of life I'd always dreamed of as a little girl watching Hallmark movies and picturing my future, but little by little things started to shift. At first it was subtle. Jason would work late, more often. He'd snap at me over tiny things, like forgetting to grab milk on the way home, or not folding his laundry the way he liked. I brushed it off as stress. He worked construction, long hours, unpredictable pay, and I kept telling myself he was just tired. But then the emotional abuse started creeping in. It wasn't like he screamed at me all the time. It was quieter than that. It was the comments under his breath, the way he'd roll his eyes when I spoke, the constant reminders of how lucky I was to have him. I remember one night in 2018, standing in the kitchen in my old Carolina Panthers hoodie, scrubbing dishes and hearing him laugh on the phone with someone. The laugh didn't sound like the one he gave me anymore. By the time I discovered his affair in 2021, I was a shell of who I used to be. And the worst part, when I confronted him, he didn't even deny it. He just stared at me, stone-faced, and said something like, "Maybe you should have tried harder." That line has been stuck in my head for years, burned into my memory like a scar I can't cover up. The divorce was brutal, it dragged on for months, and even though we finally signed the papers in October 2021, it didn't feel like closure. It felt like standing in the ruins of everything I'd built and realizing I had to somehow rebuild my entire life from scratch. The only silver lining was getting full physical custody of Ethan and Caleb. We agreed to 50-50 legal custody, which basically meant Jason could still make decisions about the boys' schooling and health. But they lived with me even after the papers were signed. Jason's presence never really left my life. It wasn't like we could just walk away from each other. We had 2 kids together, but co-parenting with him, God, it was a nightmare. He'd cancel visitations last minute, sometimes disappear for weeks, and there were months when the child support just didn't come at all. I filed him in contempt twice because I had no other choice. It wasn't about punishing him. It was about survival. Kids need clothes, food, school supplies. It's not optional. By 2022, something I didn't think was possible happened. I fell in love again. I met Mark Bennett at a friend's birthday dinner, and he was different, steady, gentle, the kind of man who really listened when I spoke. We got married in September 2022, in a small ceremony at a vineyard just outside Asheville. Ethan walked me down the aisle holding Caleb's hand, and for the first time in a long time, I felt hope again. Jason, on the other hand, remarried in I met his new wife, Samantha, once, during a custody exchange. She seemed nice in that polite, distant way people do when they don't know what's really going on behind closed doors. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Jason was still the same man, the same manipulative, prideful person, who always found a way to make himself the victim. Then 2024 hit, and things took another turn. Jason called me out of the blue, claiming he'd been in a workplace accident. According to him, he'd injured his left side while riding passenger in a company truck. At first, I felt sorry for him. I didn't want him hurt. Despite everything, he was still the boy's father. But something about the story didn't sit right with me. A few months later, I found out why. His company cut off his workers' comp after hiring a private investigator to follow him. They caught him driving, lifting and moving around just fine, basically proving that he'd exaggerated, maybe even faked, his injuries. That was my first red flag, but I didn't say anything. I let it go because honestly, I was tired. I was tired of fighting, tired of the drama, tired of being painted as the bad guy whenever I stood up for myself. But the exhaustion didn't change reality. Jason still owed months of child support. By spring of 2025, he was 6 months behind. I'd spent so much time chasing him down, reminding him, trying to hold him accountable, and I finally hit my breaking point. I handed everything over to child support enforcement, under the Department of Social Service. I thought, maybe, just maybe, letting the state handle it would take the pressure off me. That's when the threats started. Jason called furious, claiming I was ruining his life. He said that because of me, he'd be forced to get a job, which would destroy his chance of winning a supposed lawsuit against his company. He told me more than once that if he got hurt again, it would be my fault, that if something happened to him, his wife would lose a husband, and our boys would lose a father. And that's when the guilt started creeping in. Because no matter how much he's hurt me, no matter how manipulative I know he is, part of me still wonders, am I doing the right thing? I used to think the hardest part of my divorce was finding out Jason cheated. That was before I learned what it really meant to co-parent with someone who refuses to take responsibility for anything. By the time June 2025 rolled around, Jason was 6 months behind on child support. I'd done everything I could to handle it quietly, without involving anyone else, but nothing ever changed. So when I finally turned it over to child support enforcement, I expected him to be angry. What I didn't expect was the emotional hurricane that came with it. The first time he called after receiving the notice, I was folding laundry on a Sunday afternoon. I remember Ethan and Caleb were upstairs, their laughter echoing down the hall while I sat cross-legged on the bed, matching socks that somehow never seemed to have pairs anymore. The phone buzzed, and the moment I saw Jason's name on the screen, my stomach dropped. I almost didn't answer. I wish I hadn't. The second I picked up, he launched into me. He wasn't yelling, not yet, but his voice had that low, simmering edge I'd learned to fear during our marriage. He accused me of ruining his life, said I was out to destroy him, and claimed I'd just sabotaged his $1 million lawsuit against his company for the so-called accident back in 20. I told him this wasn't personal, that it wasn't about punishing him, it was about making sure the boys had what they needed, but he didn't want to hear it. He twisted every word I said, throwing it back at me like ammunition. Then came the part that really got under my skin. The guilt trip. He told me that because I forced him into getting a job, I was putting him at risk of serious injury. He said if something happened to him while working, it would be my fault, and then in that calm, manipulative tone he always used when he wanted control, he said if I get hurt again, you're the one who's taking a father away from his kids. I froze. It was like he'd reached through the phone and squeezed the air out of my lungs. It's hard to explain what that kind of manipulation does to you when you've spent years in an abusive relationship. Even after therapy, even after rebuilding parts of myself, there's this deep, ugly part of me that still reacts the same way I used to. The shame, the fear, the second guessing. It all came flooding back. For hours after that call, I couldn't focus on anything. Mark came into the bedroom at one point, saw me sitting there surrounded by half-folded laundry, and asked if I was okay. I lied. I said I was just tired, but the truth was, my brain wouldn't stop spinning. Was I being too harsh? Should I have given Jason more time? What if something really did happen to him? What would I tell Ethan and Caleb if their dad got hurt, or worse? But then the rational part of me kicked in. Jason has been spinning this same narrative for years, always the victim, always blaming everyone but himself. He claimed he couldn't work, yet a private investigator had literally caught him driving and moving around, just fine. He cried injury but somehow managed to take vacations, post happy selfies with Samantha on Instagram, and live a lifestyle that didn't exactly scream disabled. This wasn't about safety, this was about control. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. I thought back to all the times I'd covered for him. The nights I'd worked overtime just to make up for missed support payments. The birthday parties I'd scraped together on a shoestring budget, while he skipped visitations and then showed up months later, acting like father of the year. And I thought about Ethan and Caleb. They deserved stability. They deserved better than the chaos Jason constantly brought into their lives. They deserved a mom who stood up for them, even when it was hard. So I made a decision that night. I wasn't backing down. But Jason didn't take my silence as acceptance. He took it as a challenge. Over the next few weeks, the texts and calls escalated. Some days he'd try to be sweet, pretending he wanted to work things out for the boys' sake. Other days he'd rage, accusing me of being money-hungry and heartless. He sent me screenshots of conversations with his lawyer, claiming he was winning the lawsuit and that once he got his payout, I'd regret ever crossing him. I didn't respond to most of it. My therapist had warned me years ago about engaging the cycle. Jason thrived on reaction. He wanted me upset, wanted me to doubt myself, so I stopped giving him what he wanted. That only made him angrier. By July 2025, he started involving the boy. During one of his weekend visitations, he told Ethan that mommy's trying to put daddy in jail. Ethan came home crying, confused and scared, asking me why I wanted to send his dad away. I had to sit there on the couch, holding my 8-year-old's trembling hands, and explain in the simplest, gentlest words I could, that I wasn't trying to hurt daddy. I was trying to make sure daddy helped take care of them. I can't even put into words how much I hated Jason in that moment, not because he owed me money, not because of the cheating or the lies, or the endless manipulation, but because he was using our children as weapons in a fight they didn't deserve to be part of. A few days later, I got a letter in the mail from Child Support Enforcement. They'd officially started the process to garnish Jason's wages. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the envelope, feeling this mix of relief and dread. Relief because maybe, finally I wouldn't have to fight him tooth and nail every month. Dread because I knew, this was going to push him over the edge. And I was right. That night, around 10:30, my phone buzzed with a notification from an unknown number. It was a picture of me. Not just any picture. It was a photo of me leaving work that afternoon, walking to my car in the parking lot. My heart stopped. At first I thought maybe it was some creepy coincidence. Wrong number, some kind of scam. But then another text came through. Nice outfit today. Mark must be spoiling you with all that child support money you're stealing. My hands started shaking so badly I dropped the phone. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I called Mark into the room, showed him the texts, and for the first time since this whole thing started, I saw fear in his face too. We called the police. They couldn't do much without proof, but they filed a report. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak in the house sounded like footsteps. Every car that slowed down outside sent my heart racing. The next morning, Jason denied everything. He said I was paranoid and looking for attention. But deep down I knew it was him. It was exactly his style. The veiled threats, the gaslighting, the way he made me question my own reality. That was the breaking point for me. Up until then I'd been handling things quietly, trying to keep the peace, trying to protect Ethan and Caleb from the chaos. But then, this was different. This wasn't just financial anymore. This was about safety. Mine, Mark's, and most importantly, the boys. And for the first time in years, instead of feeling small and powerless, I felt something else rising in me. Rage. Not the kind of rage that makes you scream or throw things. No, this was quieter, colder, sharper. I realized that if I didn't draw a line, a hard, unshakable line, Jason was going to keep pushing until there was nothing left of me, and I wasn't going to let that happen. Not again. I had no idea then just how far he was willing to go, or how much worse things were about to get. The days after the child support enforcement letter arrived were surreal. It felt like my life had gone from shaky to completely unsteady overnight, like I was walking on a tightrope over a canyon I couldn't see the bottom of. Jason's reaction was immediate and relentless. At first, it was the texts. Dozens every day, each one more venomous than the last. He accused me of ruining his life, stealing his money, turning the boys against him. I started keeping my phone in another room because seeing his name pop up made my stomach twist into knots. But even that didn't stop the anxiety. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, imagining him driving by the house, lurking outside the school, waiting for me at the grocery store. Every noise became suspect. A car door slamming, a truck engine, even the hum of the refrigerator at night. Ethan and Caleb started picking up on it too. I remember Ethan came home one day holding Caleb's hand, his small face tight with worry. He asked if Daddy was mad at Mommy again and if we'd go to jail. I could feel my chest tighten so much I thought I might collapse. I wanted to tell him no, it's not like that, but how do you explain manipulation and legal battles to a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old? All I could do was kneel down, hold them close, and whisper that Mommy was doing everything to protect them, to make sure we were safe. Mark tried to help. He was calm, rational, and supportive, but even he admitted he was worried. He kept asking if I wanted to file a restraining order, and I resisted at first. Part of me hated feeling like the victim again. I'd fought so hard to rebuild my life after Jason, and here I was, feeling that same helplessness I'd felt years ago, trapped in fear while someone tried to control everything. At work, things weren't easy either. I noticed my focus slipping. My boss at the dental office, Doc Ramirez, asked me if I was okay during one shift, and I had to force myself to smile. I told her I was fine, but inside I felt like a storm was raging that I couldn't step out of. Some days I'd sit in the break room, staring at the wall, gripping a cup of coffee so tightly my knuckles went white. My colleagues thought I was just tired or stressed about work, but it was more than that. Every moment of every day was laced with tension, constantly calculating Jason's next move, worrying about what he might say to the boys, imagining what he might do next. And then came the court dates. The first hearing with child support enforcement was brutal in ways I didn't expect. Jason showed up, smug, acting like the whole process was just a nuisance for him. He tried to charm the judge, claiming he wanted to work, but that his disabilities made it impossible. He even brought in a doctor's note, one I later found out was questionable. The judge asked for proof, documentation, and evidence of his work capacity. I sat in the back row, Ethan and Caleb quietly playing with their toys, and tried not to cry. Part of me wanted to shout at Jason, to tell him he was lying, that he was manipulating everyone in the courtroom, but I knew that wouldn't help. After the hearing, I drove home in silence. The air was thick with humidity, the kind of heavy North Carolina air that makes your chest feel tight and sticky. I remember gripping the steering wheel so hard my hands ached. I kept thinking about all the years of abuse, the cheating, the constant lies, the manipulation, and how none of it had really ended. I realized then that the fallout of standing up for myself wasn't just legal battles or phone threats. It was living with the emotional residue, the trauma that lingered in every corner of my life. Mark tried to be my rock, but I could see the strain it was putting on him too. There were nights he'd stay up late, reading documents, calling lawyers, trying to make sense of Jason's latest claim. He never complained, but I could see the worry etched into his face. I felt guilty for dragging him into this mess, for exposing him to the kind of fear and stress I had hoped to leave behind forever. Even my friends started noticing changes in me. One afternoon, my best friend Lisa pulled me aside at a cafe, sipping her iced latte and looking genuinely concerned. She asked if I was okay, if Jason was still bothering me. I had to lie. I said yes, yes, everything was fine, but inside I felt myself unraveling a little more each day. The emotional weight of standing up for my kids and myself was exhausting, isolating, and sometimes terrifying. And the boys, God, the boys suffered the most. They didn't understand why daddy couldn't pay his child support, why mommy had to deal with the government, why our lives were suddenly so complicated. Ethan started having nightmares. Caleb became unusually clingy, following me around the house, asking questions I didn't have answers for. Every visit with Jason was tense. I'd sit in the living room, listening to the front door click shut behind them, wondering what Jason had said to try to manipulate them again. The emotional fallout hit me physically too. I developed headaches that wouldn't go away, a tightness in my shoulders that sleep couldn't fix, and this constant pit in my stomach that made me feel like I was walking around with a stone in my gut. I realized that abuse doesn't always leave bruises on your skin. Sometimes it scars your mind and heart in ways that are harder to see. But no less painful, one of the hardest moments came in August 2025, when Jason showed up late to a visitation, disheveled and defensive. He blamed me for the entire situation, claiming I was forcing him to work, threatening his recovery, and accusing me of being selfish. Ethan looked at me with those big innocent eyes and whispered, "Mommy, is Daddy mad at you?" I could feel my chest tighten. I wanted to protect them, to shield them from the toxicity, but how do you shield children from the person they love most when that person is the source of so much pain? And then there were the legal threats. Jason had started sending letters through his lawyer, claiming I was interfering with his parental rights, threatening counter lawsuits, and trying to intimidate me into backing down. Each envelope was like a punch to the gut. Each document was a reminder that I had to keep fighting, not just for myself, but for my kids. By the end of August, I realized something crucial. The fallout wasn't just Jason's anger or the legal mess. It was me confronting years of trauma I hadn't fully dealt with. I had to face the fact that the emotional abuse I'd endured, the constant gaslighting, the manipulation, the erosion of my confidence, hadn't ended with the divorce. It was still here, whispering doubts in my ear every day, trying to make me feel guilty for standing up for myself. I started journaling every night, trying to make sense of it all. I wrote down the texts, the phone calls, the threats, the fears. I wrote about my boys, my feelings of guilt, my anger, and my exhaustion. It didn't fix everything, but it was a lifeline, a way to externalize the chaos and remind myself that none of this was my fault. I also leaned heavily on therapy. My therapist, Dr. Williams, helped me recognize the patterns, the manipulation, the guilt-tripping, the emotional blackmail. She reminded me that Jason's attempts to control the narrative were exactly that, attempts to control me, to make me doubt myself. Understanding that helped me reclaim a little bit of power, even if the fear never fully went away. Through it all, I began to notice a subtle shift in Mark and me. He became more protective, more involved, more determined to support me and the boys. I realized that the fallout wasn't only destruction, it was also revealing who truly had our backs, and it was helping me see my own resilience. I'd survived emotional abuse, infidelity, manipulation, and now I was learning how to navigate post-divorce warfare while keeping my kids and myself safe. By the time September came, I felt a small, fragile sense of control returning. Jason's threats continued, but I was no longer shrinking from them. I documented everything, leaned on Mark and therapy, and reminded myself daily, I was not the cause of his anger. I was not responsible for his choices. I was responsible for protecting my children, and nothing, no amount of guilt-tripping or manipulation would make me compromise that. The fallout was messy, exhausting, and emotionally brutal, but it was also transformative. It forced me to confront old wounds, recognize manipulative behavior, and claim my right to protect my children and my life. I didn't know it then,
But this was only the beginning of the next chapter, the chapter where I would start taking real action, reclaiming my power, and learning that standing up for yourself doesn't make you cruel or heartless, it makes you human.
By late September 2025, I had reached a point where I realized that fear and anxiety were no longer going to dictate my life. I had spent months living under Jason's manipulative storm, the threats, the guilt trips, the constant emotional blackmail, and I was exhausted. But more than that, I was determined. Determined not only for my own sake, but for Ethan and Caleb, who deserved a mother who could stand strong for them. I started by documenting everything, every text, email, missed payment, broken visitation. It all went into a folder I labeled Jason Carter Evidence. I even started recording phone calls legally to make sure there was a clear record of his threats and manipulation. Part of me felt a pang of guilt, like maybe I was escalating things, but my therapist reminded me that this wasn't about revenge. This was about protection. This was about reclaiming my life. Next, I reached out to a family law attorney, Jennifer Alvarez, who specialized in high conflict custody and support cases. She had a reputation in Raleigh for being tough but fair, and when I sat in her office talking through the past months of chaos, I finally felt seen. She told me that Jason's pattern, missing support payments, manipulating the boys, threatening me, was exactly what the law was designed to protect against. She laid out options: wage garnishment, contempt filings, potential modification of custody if his behavior affected the children, and even restraining orders if needed. It was like I'd been handed a toolkit I never knew I could use. I realized that Jason had been exploiting my hesitation, my empathy, my fear. Once I understood the rules of the game, I could start playing strategically, deliberately, and without losing my moral footing.
The first step was enforcing the child support payments. JSS had already initiated wage garnishment, but I worked with Jennifer to make sure it was airtight. We requested court dates to address the 6 months he was behind and included documentation of every missed payment. I felt a flicker of hope when I realized the system could actually work, that I didn't have to chase Jason endlessly anymore. Then came the hardest part, setting boundaries with Jason. I knew that he thrived on emotional manipulation, so I created a new rule for myself: no personal responses, no explanations beyond what was legally required. Every text from him was now either ignored or responded to with short, factual replies. No emotion, no guilt, no justification. I started feeling an unexpected relief, a freedom I hadn't felt in years. Mark was instrumental during this time. He supported me quietly but firmly, attending court dates with me, helping manage the kids, and reminding me not to internalize Jason's blame. There were nights when I would wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, convinced that Jason was plotting something, and Mark would just hold me and remind me to breathe, to ground myself in reality. But the real turning point came one afternoon in October. I had a meeting with the DSS officer handling Jason's case. She was firm, professional, and unapologetic, exactly the kind of ally I needed. She told me that Jason had been flagged for patterned non-compliance, meaning that if he continued to avoid his obligations, he could face fines or even jail time. That knowledge felt like a weapon I had finally learned to wield, not to hurt him unnecessarily, but to protect my kids from ongoing instability. Jason, of course, did not take this news quietly. Within days, the calls and texts ramped up. He accused me of destroying his life, threatened to sue me personally, and tried once again to guilt me over the boys. But this time something inside me had shifted. I listened without reacting. I stayed calm, documenting everything, and for the first time in years, I felt the upper hand. I also began teaching Ethan and Caleb about boundaries in a careful, age-appropriate way. I didn't frame it as daddy is bad, because he wasn't, but I explained that sometimes adults make mistakes or don't follow the rules, and that it was their job to stay safe, love each other, and trust me to handle the complicated stuff. They started to relax. They began sleeping better, laughing more freely, and slowly, the tension in the house eased. Emotionally, I had to rebuild too. I started journaling not just to record Jason's behavior, but to process my own feelings, my anger, my fear, my lingering self-doubt. I realized that part of the reason I'd been so susceptible to his manipulation was that I had internalized years of abuse, letting it shape how I reacted to conflict. By writing down the truths, this is not my fault. I am protecting my kids. I am allowed to set boundaries. I slowly rewired my thinking. Financially, Mark and I got more organized. We opened a dedicated savings account for the boys' needs, created a calendar for Jason's visitations to ensure consistency, and worked out a plan to handle any unexpected child support gaps. The logistics felt empowering. It was tangible evidence that we were taking control instead of reacting endlessly to Jason's chaos. And then finally, in November 2025, something unexpected happened. Jason called to negotiate a payment plan for his back child support. At first, I was suspicious. He tried to guilt me again, claiming the stress was affecting his health and that his wife would lose everything. But this time, I didn't react. I calmly explained that the court had made the terms and that compliance was non-negotiable. He grumbled, made veiled threats, and hung up. I felt relief wash over me in a way I hadn't in years. Not because Jason had changed, he hadn't, but because I had. I had found my voice, my boundaries, and my strategy. I had turned the tables, not by stooping to manipulation or anger, but by staying grounded, focused, and unwavering. Mark and I celebrated quietly that night after the boys went to bed. We poured glasses of wine and sat on the couch, listening to the soft hum of the house, finally feeling a sense of safety. I realized that the turning point wasn't the court orders, the garnished wages, or even Jason's begrudging compliance. It was me reclaiming my power, my emotional, mental, and practical control, and refusing to let fear dictate my choices. By December, there were still bumps in the road. Jason would miss a payment here or there, or send another guilt-laden message. But each time, I followed the same process. Document, set boundaries, protect the kids, stay calm, and each time, I realized something profound. He could no longer control me the way he used to. I was no longer shrinking from fear. I was no longer letting manipulation dictate my life. This chapter of my life, this fight with Jason, was exhausting, painful, and emotionally brutal. But it taught me a lesson I never expected. The true power doesn't come from anger, revenge, or manipulation. It comes from clarity, consistency, and the courage to protect what matters most. I was finally starting to breathe again. I could feel myself letting go of the anxiety that had plagued me for years, making space for hope, stability, and trust, both in myself and in the life Mark and I were building with Ethan and Caleb. The fallout was still there, lurking in the background like a shadow. But for the first time, I felt like I could face it without fear, without guilt, and without losing myself. By early 2026, life had started to feel different. Not perfect. Nothing about this journey had been perfect, but steady, grounded, and mine again. The months of legal battles, phone threats, emotional manipulation, and sleepless nights had left scars, but they had also left lessons. I had learned in the hardest way possible that protecting yourself and your children is not selfish, it's necessary. Jason had finally begun making consistent child support payments. The garnishment from his wages was finally in place, and though he still grumbled in text messages and emails, the constant cycle of fear and anxiety had the court had recognized his pattern of manipulation and non-compliance, and I had a sense of legal backing that allowed me to breathe without constantly watching my back. It wasn't just relief, it was freedom. Emotionally, I felt a shift in myself that I hadn't anticipated. I could now recognize manipulation when it appeared and respond without internalizing guilt. I no longer questioned my decisions or blamed myself for taking action. Instead, I felt a quiet strength, an unshakable sense that I was doing right by my children and by myself. Ethan and Caleb were flourishing. Their smiles were no longer tinged with worry, their laughter was lighter, and their confidence grew with every day of consistent routines and a stable environment. I watched them one Saturday morning at Pullen Park, running through the playground, laughing and shouting with abandon, and I realized how much I had feared I might never get to see this piece. I felt a lump in my throat, relief, pride, and the kind of love that hurts in its intensity. Mark and I had also grown stronger as a team. The struggle with Jason had tested our relationship, but it had also revealed its foundation: trust, communication, and shared commitment. We talked openly about fears, worries, and future plans. We even started planning a longer family vacation for spring, somewhere we could just breathe, somewhere far from courtrooms and legal threats. Asheville again, maybe, or the coast. Letting the boys feel sand between their toes, instead of tension at every turn. And then there were moments of reflection, painful, unavoidable, but necessary. I thought about the years lost to fear and manipulation, the emotional abuse that had shaped so much of my life. I thought about Jason, and I realized something profound. He had not changed, he might never change, but my life didn't need to revolve around his choices anymore. I had built boundaries that worked, a life that was mine, and the knowledge that I could navigate challenges without losing myself. One evening in March, I sat on the back porch with a journal, a cup of chamomile tea in hand, watching the sun dip behind the trees. Ethan and Caleb were inside, doing homework, their laughter occasionally floating out the window. I reflected on the past 5 years, the marriage, the betrayal, the divorce, the abuse, the court battles, and the slow, painstaking reclamation of my life. The journey had been exhausting, heartbreaking, and terrifying, but I was here, I was alive, I was standing. I remembered one moment from late 2025, after Jason had sent yet another manipulative text. I had read it, felt the old familiar surge of panic, and then for the first time in years, I didn't reply, I didn't engage, I simply documented it, saved it, and let it go. That was the moment I truly began to reclaim my power. When I realized that my responses didn't need to feed his chaos, my life didn't need to revolve around his manipulations. The boys learned something important too, albeit slowly and unconscious. They saw me assert boundaries, stay calm under pressure, and protect what mattered most. They learned that standing up for yourself is not the same as being unkind, that safety, honesty, and love are stronger than fear. Watching them internalize this, watching their confidence grow, was one of the most profound rewards of the entire struggle. Even with all the progress, there were reminders of the past. Sometimes, Jason would send a curt email or make a vague threat. Sometimes I'd see him on the street, and a flicker of old anxiety would pass through me, but each time, I reminded myself I had survived worse. I had boundaries, I had legal support, I had the strength that comes from surviving emotional abuse. I could handle it. There were moments of quiet joy too. One afternoon in April, Ethan brought home a drawing he had made at school. It was a family portrait: Mark, me, Caleb, and himself, holding hands and smiling. At the bottom he'd written, "We are safe now." I stared at it for a long time, tears streaming down my face. Safe. That word carried so much weight after everything we'd been through. I also started sharing parts of my journey with close friends, cautiously, realizing that my story, my resilience, might help someone else trapped in manipulation or abuse. I became more vocal about boundaries, about recognizing emotional abuse, about trusting yourself and standing firm even when it's scary. It wasn't about shaming Jason or dwelling on the past. It was about reclaiming my narrative and using it as a tool for healing. By the time summer rolled around, the tension that had defined so much of my life since the divorce had eased. I still remembered the fear, the panic, the sleepless nights, but they no longer controlled me. I could look back at the chaos and recognize how far I had come. I had faced manipulation, threats, and a legal battle that seemed impossible, and I had emerged, not broken, but stronger. One night, I tucked Ethan and Caleb into bed and lingered in their room, watching them drift off to sleep. I thought about how much I had feared losing them to circumstance, to Jason's manipulations, to the chaos of life itself, but they were safe, happy, and thrived. And I realized then that all the struggle, all the pain, All the sleepless nights had led me to a place where love, protection, and resilience could coexist. Mark joined me on the porch afterward, and we sat in comfortable silence, sipping tea, listening to the crickets sing. I felt a profound sense of closure, not because Jason had changed, he hadn't, but because I had. I had reclaimed my life, my family, and my peace of mind. I had learned that courage isn't about confrontation alone, it's about knowing when to act, when to stand firm, and when to let go of the guilt that manipulative people try to heap onto you. As I watched the sunset melt behind the horizon, I allowed myself to breathe fully for the first time in years. The boys were safe. Jason's influence over our lives had been curtailed. I had boundaries, support, and the inner strength that comes from surviving and thriving despite adversity. I realized then that life, even after trauma, can still be beautiful. It can still be full of laughter, love, and quiet moments of joy. It can still be mine. And for the first time in a very long time, I allowed myself to hope, not for perfection, not for Jason's compliance, not for a world without challenges, but for a future where I and my children could thrive, no matter what. The road had been brutal, the scars still lingered, and some days were still hard, but I knew this: I would never let fear, manipulation, or guilt dictate my life again. I would never let anyone make me doubt my right to protect my children and myself. And in that quiet, unshakable moment, I felt truly